The holographic display flickered to life in the command chamber of the Krillian mercenary guild headquarters and commander. Thrace studied the contract details with his cold reptilian eyes that had witnessed countless campaigns across 70 star systems, and he found nothing unusual about this particular assignment, which promised standard payment for what appeared to be routine suppression work against a defaulting colony. The target was a human settlement called Nouvelle Terra, and the briefing materials described humans as a recently contacted species with minimal military capability and outdated defensive technology that barely qualified as Class 7 civilization status according to Galactic Council standards. And Thrace had handled dozens of such operations throughout his career, where lesser species required stern reminders about their obligations to more powerful patrons. His second in command, Velker, entered the chamber with his scales reflecting the blue light from the tactical displays, and he carried additional intelligence reports about the target species that the Zorvath Consortium had provided along with the contract terms. And when he began reading the data, his expression shifted from confidence to mild concern, which caught Thrace's attention immediately. "Commander, there is something unusual about these humans," Velker said, while scrolling through population statistics that showed exponential growth patterns across 17 different colony worlds within just 2 generations since they had achieved faster-than-light travel capability, and their expansion rate exceeded anything the Krillian databases had recorded for species at similar technological development levels. Thrace dismissed the concern with a wave of his clawed hand, because numbers meant nothing without proper military infrastructure to support them, and the intelligence reports clearly indicated that human defensive capabilities consisted of outdated satellites and converted civilian vessels that posed no threat to a properly equipped mercenary force with modern weapons and experienced soldiers. "They breed like parasites," Thrace said, while finalizing the deployment orders for 200 of his best troops, along with 6 assault carriers and supporting fleet elements that would be more than sufficient to handle 8,000 colonists armed with nothing more dangerous than farming equipment and perhaps a few personal defense weapons. The contract specified that the Zorvath Consortium required complete submission from the colony within 48 hours or total elimination of the settlement, as an example to other human colonies that might consider defaulting on their tribute obligations. And Thrace had no doubt which outcome would occur, because species this young and inexperienced always chose survival over pride when faced with overwhelming force. He assembled his battalion commanders in the strategic planning room, where holographic representations of Nouvelle Terra rotated above the central table, showing 3 primary population centers, surrounded by agricultural zones and a small industrial complex that produced basic machinery for farming operations. And the tactical assessment indicated minimal resistance potential, with suggested deployment patterns that would secure all major sites within 3 hours. "This will be simple work," Thrace told his officers while highlighting landing zones that would allow rapid deployment of ground forces with supporting fire from orbital positions, and he outlined the standard suppression protocol that had proven effective across hundreds of previous operations against rebellious colonies throughout the sector. The fleet departed from Krillian space with confidence and discipline that came from decades of successful military operations, and the journey to human territory took 6 days through established trade routes that the Zorvath Consortium controlled under various commercial agreements, and none of the human vessels they encountered showed any sign of military awareness or defensive posturing. When they arrived at the edge of the Nouvelle Terra system, Thrace ordered standard reconnaissance sweeps that revealed exactly what the intelligence reports had predicted, with 3 ancient defense satellites orbiting the colony world, along with a handful of civilian transport vessels that scattered immediately upon detecting the mercenary fleet's arrival. The orbital defenses activated their targeting systems, which dated back at least 40 years. According to Thrace's weapons officer, and they pose no real threat to modern military shields that could absorb their limited firepower indefinitely. And Thrace ordered his communications officer to broadcast the standard ultimatum on all frequencies that the colonists would certainly be monitoring. This is Commander Thrace of the Krillian Mercenary Guild, operating under legitimate contract from the Zorvith Consortium, he announced, while his fleet moved into optimal bombardment positions around the planet, and his voice carried the weight of authority that came from 50 successful campaigns. The colony of Nouvelle Terra has defaulted on tribute payments and commercial obligations, he continued, while watching his tactical displays show the defensive satellites attempting to achieve targeting locks that his point defense systems would easily counter, and he allowed a moment of silence to let the weight of their situation sink into whatever colonial government existed on the surface. You have 1 standard hour to signal complete surrender and prepare for occupation forces, Thrace said with finality that had convinced countless other colonies to choose survival over feudal resistance, and he fully expected the response would be immediate capitulation, followed by a few days of administrative work to install new leadership loyal to the consortium. The response came after 37 minutes, and a human voice spoke with unexpected calmness that carried no trace of fear or panic that Thrace had learned to expect from doomed colonists facing overwhelming military superiority, and the speaker identified herself as Governor Sarah Chun of Nouvelle Terra Colonial Administration. Commander Thrace, we have received your ultimatum and discussed it with our colonial council, Governor Chun said, and her voice remained steady and professional, as though she were negotiating a trade agreement rather than facing potential annihilation, and Thrace felt the first hint of unease at her tone. We respectfully decline your terms, she continued, and those words hung in the command center like a physical presence, because colonies never declined when facing this level of force, and they always chose surrender over death. And Thrace leaned forward in his command chair with sudden intense focus. We acknowledge your military superiority, and we understand the consequences of our decision, Governor Chen said, and background noise suggested she was speaking from some kind of command center with multiple people working at stations around her, and Thrace could hear the calm efficiency in those background sounds that seemed wrong for a colony facing destruction. However, we are human colonists operating under the protection of Earth Colonial Charter, and your attack on our settlement constitutes an act of war against humanity itself, she explained, and her words carried absolute conviction that made Thrace's tactical officers exchange uncertain glances across the command center. We therefore request that you leave our system immediately, Governor Chen concluded, and her final words were delivered with the same professional courtesy she had maintained throughout the entire communication, and then she added something that would haunt Thrace for the rest of his life. Commander, you should know that we have already transmitted notification of your attack to Earth Defense Command, she said, and for the first time, Thrace detected something in her voice that might have been pity or perhaps warning, and it made his scales prickle with instinctive unease. You have made a terrible mistake, Governor Chen said, and then the communication ended. Thrace stared at the display for several seconds while his officers waited for orders, and he considered that unprecedented refusal and the strange confidence in the governor's voice, and he thought about the intelligence reports that described humans as minor players with limited military capacity. Begin the landing operation, he ordered finally, because contracts were contracts, and his reputation depended on successful completion regardless of how unusual the circumstances might seem. And his assault carriers moved into position above the 3 population centers, while dropships prepared to deploy ground forces. Invasion of Nouvelle Terra began, and Commander Thrace had no idea that he had just triggered events that would change the entire galaxy's understanding of what humans truly were. The dropships descended through Nouvelle Terra's atmosphere in perfect formation, and Thrace watched the tactical displays from his command ship, while 200 Krillian mercenaries prepared for what should have been a routine occupation operation. And the first wave targeted the largest population center that intelligence designated as Landing Site Prime, with approximately 3,000 human. Colonist strike leader Corvin commanded the initial assault force, and his dropship touched down in the central plaza where colonial administration buildings surrounded an open area perfect for establishing a command post, and his troops deployed with practiced efficiency while scanning for targets, and they found nothing but empty streets and abandoned vehicles. No contacts. Corvin reported over the tactical network while his soldiers moved into building clearing formations and advanced toward the administrative complex where Governor Chem had broadcast her defiant message, and the eerie silence made his combat instincts trigger warning signals that he had learned to trust after 30 years of mercenary work. The other landing sites reported similar situations with empty streets and no sign of the colonists who should have been fleeing in panic or attempting futile resistance with whatever weapons they could gather, and Thrace studied the patterns with growing unease because populations did not simply vanish, and they had to be somewhere within the settlement zones. Spread out and locate the colonists, Thrace ordered while deploying aerial drones to scan for thermal signatures and movement in the surrounding buildings, and the drones detected thousands of heat signatures scattered throughout the urban areas, but the readings showed no movement and no panic, and just people waiting in positions that seemed almost tactical. Corvin's unit reached the administrative building, and his point soldier triggered the door controls, which opened to reveal a dark interior that their helmet lights barely penetrated, and he sent 2 scouts inside, following standard entry protocols, and they made it approximately 5 meters before the ambush erupted with devastating efficiency. The humans had turned the building into a kill zone, and Corvin heard his scouts screaming over the communication network, while weapons fire tore through their armor from multiple angles, and he saw their life signs flatline before he could even process what was happening. And then explosives detonated throughout the ground floor in a coordinated sequence. "Contact! Contact!" Corvin shouted while pulling his unit back from the building and returned fire from his soldiers. Shattered windows were muzzle flashes indicated human positions, and he expected the ambush to break once his superior firepower suppressed the enemy positions, but the humans did not retreat, and they did not stop firing. A human emerged from a side entrance, and Corvin's combat computer identified her as a female colonist wearing basic body armor and carrying a rifle that looked almost primitive compared to Krillian military weapons, and she fired while running directly at his position without any attempt at cover or tactical movement, and her shots struck 2 of his soldiers before return fire cut her down, but she did not die immediately, and even with fatal wounds, she continued firing until her weapon ran empty, and then she triggered something in her hand, and the explosion killed 3 more Krillian soldiers who had moved to secure her body, and Corvin stared at the crater where she had been with complete incomprehension of what he had just witnessed. "They're insane," one of his soldiers said over the network, and similar reports began flooding in from all 3 landing sites where humans attacked with tactics that made no sense from any military perspective. And they traded their lives for minimal tactical gains, and they fought with injured soldiers continuing combat until blood loss or trauma forced them to stop. Thrace watched his casualty counter climb with mounting horror because 20 mercenaries were dead within the first hour and 50 were wounded, and they had barely secured any of their initial objectives, and the humans employed guerrilla tactics that his soldiers had never encountered from supposedly primitive colonists. The second wave landed with heavier weapons and armored support vehicles that should have turned the tide, but the humans adapted immediately, and they targeted vehicle crews with precision fire, and they used improvised explosives made from mining charges that turned streets into death traps, and they fought from every building and every corner with absolute Refusal to surrender Corvin's unit cleared a residential block and found human civilians, including children, moving through underground tunnels that connected the buildings, and when his soldiers tried to capture them for questioning the adults, attacked with knives and tools and whatever they could use as weapons, and they fought until death while the children escaped through passages too small for Krillian soldiers to follow. These are not soldiers, Corvin reported to Thrace, while his medics worked on wounded troops in a secured building that humans had booby-trapped with so many explosives that clearing it took 2 hours and cost 5 more casualties, and his voice carried shock that decades of combat experience had never prepared him for. These are farmers and factory workers and teachers, he continued while reviewing helmet camera footage that showed a middle-aged human male with a farming tool scar on his arm, fighting 3 Krillian soldiers with a homemade explosive device, and he killed all 3 before dying to supporting fire from a 4th soldier. Thrace ordered orbital bombardment of a building complex where sensor sweeps indicated a large human gathering that might be a command center, and he watched the targeting solution develop while his weapons officer prepared to strike. And then proximity alarms screamed as something attached to his ship's hull breach in Cargo Bay 7. Damage control reported, and Thrace pulled up security cameras to see humans in void suits cutting through his ship's armor with industrial equipment, and they moved with the same fearless determination that the ground forces had shown, and they planted charges on critical systems before his security teams could respond. The explosions crippled 2 of his assault carriers and killed the crews of 3 more dropships that were preparing for the 3rd wave deployment, and Thrace realized with cold certainty that humans had somehow launched a counterattack against his orbital assets, using nothing but civilian mining gear and suits designed for asteroid work. He ordered his fleet to higher orbit, while his remaining dropships evacuated wounded from the surface, and the withdrawal was chaotic because humans harassed every extraction point with sniper fire and mortar, and they seemed to know exactly where his forces would retreat, and they had prepared ambushes along every logical route. The ground commanders reported 75 dead and over 100 wounded, and they had secured exactly 0 of their primary objectives, and the humans controlled most of the urban areas and showed no sign of weakening or losing morale, and Thrace could not comprehend how farmers could fight like elite military units. His soldiers captured a human during the withdrawal, and they brought her to the command ship for interrogation, and she was a young woman with a bullet wound in her shoulder and burns on her legs, and she smiled when they threw her into the detention cell, and Thrace could not understand why someone facing torture and death would smile. "Why are you fighting?" Thrace demanded while standing outside her cell, and he genuinely wanted to understand what drove these creatures to such irrational behavior. And the woman looked at him with eyes that showed pain, but no fear, and that disturbed him more than her wounds. "You attacked our colony," she said, simply, as though that explained everything, and Thrace shook his head because that was not an answer, and colonies surrendered when facing superior force, because survival mattered more than pride or honor. "You cannot win," he told her while gesturing at the displays showing his fleet in orbit and the tactical superiority his forces possessed, despite the unexpected casualties, and she would surely recognize the futility of continued resistance. "We don't need to win," the woman replied, and blood dripped from her shoulder wound onto the cell floor, and she seemed unconcerned about her injuries or her situation, and Thrace leaned closer to the energy barrier that separated them. "We just need to make you understand what you've done," she continued, and her smile widened despite the pain she must have been experiencing, and Thrace felt his combat instincts screaming warnings that something was very wrong. "Earth will hear about this," she said, and those words carried absolute certainty that made Thrace's scales prickle with the same unease he had felt during Governor Chum's transmission, and the woman's next words would echo in his mind for the rest of his life. "And then you'll learn what we really are." She said Thrace ordered her execution because keeping prisoners who refused to break under interrogation was pointless, and he had a mission to complete and a reputation to maintain, and he tried to focus on tactical solutions while his casualty reports continued to climb. But her words lingered, and 3 days into what should have been a 3-hour operation, Thrace had lost half his force, and the humans showed no sign of surrendering, and he began to wonder if perhaps Governor Chun had been right and he had made a terrible mistake. 3 days of constant combat had reduced Thrace's mercenary force to barely 100 effective soldiers, and the humans continued fighting with tactics that defied every principle of rational warfare, and they sacrificed entire squads for marginal tactical gains, and they broadcast the screams of captured Krullian soldiers over all frequencies as psychological warfare that rattled even his most experienced veterans. The ground war had become a nightmare of ambush and booby traps and suicide. Attacks that cost Krullian lives for every meter of ground they tried to hold, and the humans seemed to have unlimited supplies of improvised explosives, and they knew the urban terrain better than any tactical database could map, and they moved through tunnels and passages that sensors could not detect. Corvin had been killed on day 2, when a human child no older than 12 standard years approached his position waving a white flag, and when he moved to accept to surrender, the child detonated explosives that killed Corvin and 4 other soldiers, and Thrace had watched the helmet camera footage with sick horror at what these creatures would do to win. His remaining commanders pleaded for permission to withdraw because holding positions cost lives faster than they could evacuate wounded, and the humans never stopped attacking, and they never showed fear, and they never surrendered, even when surrounded with no hope of survival, and it was like fighting an enemy that valued death more than life. Thrace considered orbital bombardment of the entire colony because his contract with the Zorith Consortium allowed for complete elimination if suppression proved impossible, and he was positioning his ships for planetary strikes when his sensor officer detected an incoming faster-than-light signature at the edge of the system, single vessel dropping from FTL. The officer reported while pulling up identification data that showed a human warship designated UESS Indomitable, and the database listed it as an outdated cruiser design that was at least 40 years behind current human military standards according to what limited intelligence the Krullian Guild possessed. Thrace felt relief because one old warship against his remaining fleet elements should be manageable, and he could destroy it before returning to the business of suppressing the colony, and he ordered his weapons officers to target the human ship as soon as it came within range. The Indomitable completed its FTL transition and immediately launched missiles at 3 of Thrace's capital ships, and the weapons moved faster than his point defense systems could track, and they struck with precision that suggested targeting technology far beyond what the database specifications indicated. 3 of his ships simply ceased to exist, and the explosions lit up the darkness of space like miniature suns, and Thrace stared at his displays in shock because those vessels had modern shields and armor that should have absorbed or deflected primitive human weapons, and yet they were gone in seconds. All ships' evasive maneuvers Thrace ordered while his remaining vessels scattered across orbital space and tried to achieve firing solutions on the human warship that moved with speed and agility that seemed impossible for something its size. En masse, the Indomitable opened communications on all frequencies, and a human voice spoke with calm authority that reminded Thrace of Governor Chun's earlier transmission, and the speaker identified herself as Admiral Catherine Chen, and Thrace realized with sinking certainty that the colony governor and the warship commander might be related. "This is the United Earth Expeditionary Force," Admiral Chun announced while her ship destroyed 2 more Krullian vessels with weapons fired that carved through military-grade armor like it was paper, and Thrace watched his fleet die with the helpless horror of someone who had finally realized they were prey instead of predator. You have attacked human civilians without provocation or declaration of war. The Admiral continued, and her ship launched fighters that his sensors had not detected during the initial scan, and they swarmed his remaining vessels with coordinated precision that spoke of extensive combat training. You have 10 minutes to abandon the surface and leave this system, Admiral Chun said, and her voice carried no anger or hatred, and just cold professional certainty that made her words more terrifying than any threat could have been. After that, we stopped taking prisoners, she concluded. Thrace tried to contact the Zorvith Consortium for guidance, but communications were being jammed by human electronic warfare systems that were somehow more sophisticated than Krillian military technology, and he was alone with a dying fleet and ground forces that were being systematically slaughtered by colonists who fought like demons. We are legitimate military contractors. Thrace broadcast on emergency frequencies while ordering his ground forces to evacuate immediately, and he hoped that explaining the legal framework might convince the humans to show mercy. The Zorvith Consortium commissioned this action under standard commercial law. He continued while watching another of his ships explode under human missile fire, and his remaining vessels struggled to achieve FTL jump calculations while under constant attack. Admiral Chun's response destroyed any hope of negotiation with words that carried the weight of absolute conviction and finality that Thrace had never heard from any species he had encountered in 50 years of warfare. "We don't care who hired you," she said, and her ship moved into position above his flagship while her weapons locked onto critical systems that would cripple rather than destroy. "You attacked humans," Admiral Chun said, and those 3 words contained more threat than 1,000 tactical briefings could convey. Thrace ordered emergency evacuation protocols while his remaining dropships tried to extract ground forces under fire from both the colonists below and the human warship above, and most of his soldiers never made it to the landing zones because the humans had prepared for this and they had positioned forces to cut off every escape route. His flagship took damage that disabled the main engines and left them drifting in orbit, while human fighters strafed the hull and disabled point defense. Systems and communications arrays and life support began failing as explosions tore through deck after deck. "Prepare to be boarded," Admiral Chun announced, and Thrace watched in his command display as human soldiers in assault armor attached to his hull and began cutting through with weapons that melted Krillian military alloys like they were ice. Boarding action was brief and brutal, and the humans moved through his ship with tactical precision that suggested they had studied Krillian vessel layouts extensively, and they killed anyone who resisted and disabled anyone who surrendered, and Thrace found himself dragged to what remained of his command center by soldiers who handled him like dangerous cargo. Admiral Chun materialized as a hologram before him, and she was a middle-aged human female with gray in her hair and scars on her face that spoke of combat experience, and her eyes held the same cold certainty that Governor Chun's voice had carried during that first transmission. "Commander Thrace," she said while studying him with the detached interest of a scientist examining an interesting specimen, and he wanted to speak and explain and negotiate, but his voice failed him because he was looking at something he had never seen before. "You attacked my sister's colony," Admiral Chun said, and Thrace understood then that the two Chuns were indeed related, and he had killed the Admiral's family members and triggered a response that went beyond military protocol or rational strategy. "You killed 43 human civilians, including children," she continued, and her voice remained calm, but Thrace could see rage burning in her eyes that she controlled through what must have been tremendous effort. "By rights, I should execute you and every survivor from your force," Admiral Chun said, and Thrace believed her absolutely because he had seen what humans would do when fighting for their lives and he had no doubt what they would do when seeking revenge. But Earth Command wants the galaxy to understand what happens when you attack us, she explained, and one of her soldiers approached with a data storage device that looked like standard Krillian technology. Return to your guild, Admiral Chun ordered while the soldier placed the device in Thrace's clawed hand, and he held it like it might explode at any moment. Show them this, she said, and her holographic form leaned closer until Thrace could see the details of her scars and the absolute conviction in her expression. Let them understand what happens when you touch our people, Admiral Chun concluded, and then she was gone, and human soldiers were dragging Thrace toward an escape pod that they loaded with the 37 survivors from his original force of 200. The pod ejected into space, and Thrace watched through the viewport as the Indomitable systematically destroyed every Krillian ship that had not already jumped to FTL, and the human warship moved with practiced efficiency that spoke of experience and training and capabilities that no intelligence report had mentioned. His pod drifted for 6 hours before an automated recovery beacon attracted a passing merchant vessel, and Thrace clutched the data device that Admiral Chun had given him, and he knew with terrible certainty that whatever it contained would change everything to Galaxra. The Krillian Guild Council chamber fell silent as the holographic display activated and showed footage from the battle at Nouvelle Terra, and the 12 council members watched human colonists fighting with a ferocity that made their scales prickle with instinctive fear, and they saw farmers and teachers and children fighting against professional soldiers without hesitation or mercy. But the combat footage was only the beginning, and the data device contained something far more disturbing that Admiral Chun had compiled specifically for this audience, and it was a historical record of humanity's past that no intelligence agency had bothered to investigate, because humans seemed too young and too peaceful to warrant deep research. The first section showed ancient Earth and conflicts that predated faster than light travel by thousands of years, and the council watched humans fighting each other with primitive weapons made from sharpened metal and wood, and the casualty numbers from single battles exceeded the populations of some modern colonies. They fought themselves, council member Zareth whispered while watching formations of human soldiers charging into certain death against other human soldiers, and the recording showed battles where tens of thousands died in single days, and the survivors simply regrouped and fought again. The historical record moved forward through time and showed human technological advancement that seemed driven primarily by the need to kill each other more efficiently, and they developed explosives and automatic weapons and aircraft, and every innovation found military application before civilian use. Then came the world wars, and the council watched in mounting horror as humans mobilized entire planetary populations for conflicts that killed millions and destroyed cities and created weapons so terrible that using them meant potential extinction. And yet the wars continued, because humans seemed incapable of backing down from confrontation. 60 million dead, council member Thrakis said while watching footage of human cities reduced to rubble and mass graves, and destruction on a scale that modern galactic warfare had not seen in centuries, and the humans had done this to themselves twice. Within 30 years, the nuclear weapons appeared in the historical record, and the council saw the aftermath of their use on actual population centers, and they watched humans create arsenals capable of sterilizing their entire planet multiple times over, and the calculations showed that Earth came within minutes of total nuclear war on several occasions. They almost destroyed themselves, Thrakis continued, and his voice carried disbelief, because species that survived to reach space travel had usually evolved past such self-destructive tendencies, and yet humans had achieved faster-than-light capability while still maintaining weapons that could end their civilization. The historical record showed proxy wars and regional conflicts that continued even after humans recognized the danger of their own weapons, and they fought in jungles and deserts and mountains. And they developed new tactics and strategies and refined their ability to kill with efficiency that increased every generation. Chemical weapons and biological agents appeared in the record, along with evidence that humans had created and stockpiled diseases that could kill billions, and they had done this deliberately and maintained these weapons even after agreeing to ban them, and the council members exchanged glances that spoke of shared terror. Why would they create such things? Jareth asked. And the question hung in the air unanswered, because no rational species would develop weapons that guaranteed mutual destruction unless something fundamental in their psychology drove them toward it. Then the footage shifted to more recent human history and showed their expansion into space and their establishment of colonies and their diplomatic outreach too. The galactic community and the council felt brief relief, because surely this represented humanity's evolution past their violent origins. But Admiral Chen's narration began over the footage, and her voice carried information that made the relief evaporate like water on a hot stone, and she explained that humans considered the last 100 years their peaceful era, and this was them being civilized and restrained and holding back from their true nature. The soldiers you fought on Nouvelle Terra were civilians, Admiral, Chen's recorded voice said, while the display showed the same colonists who had killed 100 Krillian mercenaries going about normal lives as farmers and teachers and parents. They had no military training beyond basic civil defense courses. She continued, and the footage showed those courses, which consisted of a few weeks of instruction every few years, and yet those untrained civilians had fought like elite special forces. Every human colony maintains these programs because we know what we are, Admiral Chen explained, and the council watched more footage of human children as young as 10 learning basic combat skills and emergency protocols and how to make improvised weapons from common materials. We teach our children to fight because our history taught us that survival requires it, the Admiral said, and the display showed human educational materials that included not just mathematics and science, but also tactical thinking and threat assessment, and how to recognize when violence becomes necessary. The footage shifted to human military forces and showed training exercises that pushed soldiers beyond limits that would kill most other species, and they ran until exhaustion and fought in conditions that ranged from Arctic cold to desert heat, and they practiced tactics that assumed casualties and accepted losses as part of mission success. Our military operates under strict rules of engagement, Admiral Chen's voice continued, and the council saw footage of human soldiers showing restraint and discipline when dealing with other species, and they followed laws and protocols that limited their actions even when holding overwhelming advantage. These rules exist to protect others from us, the Admiral said, and the implications settled over the council chamber like a heavy weight because it meant humans recognized their own danger and actively worked to control it. The display showed technical specifications for human weapons that the Krillian intelligence services had dismissed as outdated or primitive, and Admiral Chen's narration explained why those assessments were catastrophically wrong. We design our civilian technology to be convertible to military use within hours, she said, and the footage showed how human mining equipment became weapons and how their industrial base could shift to war production faster than any other species in the galaxy. We build redundancy into everything because we assume our enemies will target our infrastructure. Admiral Chen continued, and the display showed human colony layouts with hidden bunkers and backup power systems and supply caches that explained how Nouvelle Terra's colonists sustained 3 days of constant combat. The technical data included information about human warships, and the council learned that the Indomitable was indeed 40 years old by human standards, but it had been continuously upgraded with weapons and systems that matched or exceeded current galactic military technology. We never throw anything away, Admiral Chen said, and the footage showed massive shipyards where humans maintained and updated vessels that other species would have scrapped, and they had hundreds of these outdated but deadly ships in reserve fleets scattered across their territory. Then came the most terrifying revelation as the display showed human population statistics and growth projections, and the council saw that humans numbered in the hundreds of billions across their 17 colony worlds and their home system, and they were still expanding at rates that suggested they would double again within 2 generations. "We have been diplomatic because we chose to be," Admiral Chun said, and her voice carried an edge that made the council members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "We have followed your laws and accepted your trade restrictions and limited our expansion because we wanted to be part of the galactic community," she continued, and the footage showed human diplomats patiently negotiating agreements that clearly favored other species. "But you attacked our civilians," Admiral Chun said, and the display returned to footage from Nouvelle Terra showing Krillian soldiers killing human colonists, including children, and the council watched Thrace's forces committing acts that would haunt them. "You killed 43 of our people, including 12 children." The Admiral's voice carried cold rage that burned through the recording, and the display showed each victim's name and face and age. "You have shown us that the galaxy sees humans as targets," Admiral Chun said, and the footage shifted to show similar incidents where other species had attacked or exploited human colonies, and the council realized this was not an isolated event, but a pattern. "You have reminded us what we are," she continued, and the display showed human history again with all its violence and warfare and weapons of mass destruction. The message concluded with Admiral Chun's face filling the holographic display, and she looked directly at the camera with eyes that promised retribution, and her final words would be repeated across the galaxy within days. "Nouvelle Terra was a test, and you failed," she said with absolute certainty. "Humanity is withdrawing from all existing treaties pending review." Admiral Chun continued, and the council members felt cold dread because human withdrawal meant economic disruption and military uncertainty across multiple sectors. Any further aggression against human assets will be met rapid dispo. 6 months after the Nouvelle Terra incident, the galactic political landscape had transformed in ways that no one could have predicted, and the ripple effects of humanity's response continued spreading through civilizations that had considered humans insignificant newcomers to the interstellar community. The Zorvath Consortium collapsed within 8 weeks when humanity released complete records of their tribute schemes to every major news network in the galaxy, and the evidence showed decades of exploitation and illegal taxation of colonies that lacked military protection, and 3 consortium board members faced criminal charges while their entire commercial empire dissolved into bankruptcy. Other mercenary guilds watched the Krillian Guild's humiliation and made quiet policy changes that banned contracts involving human targets, and some guilds dissolved entirely when their members refused to accept any assignments that might bring them into conflict with Earth's forces, and the mercenary market contracted by 30% as species reconsidered the ethics of their profession. Thrace had become something he never imagined in his 50 years of military service, and he was now an ambassador of sorts, traveling between systems and speaking to anyone who would listen about the true nature of humanity, and his warnings carried weight because everyone knew his reputation and his failure. "They are not like us," Thrace told the Vrelian Defense Council while standing before their strategic planning committee, and his scales had regained some color, but his eyes still held the haunted look of someone who had seen too much. "When we fight, we calculate costs and benefits, and we retreat when losses exceed acceptable parameters," he explained while displaying tactical data from Nouvelle Terra that showed human combat behavior that violated every principle of rational warfare. "Humans don't calculate like that," Thrace continued, and the Vrelian officers leaned forward to study the footage of colonists fighting past the point where any other species would have surrendered. They fight because something in their evolution made them survivors, and they will sacrifice everything to protect their own," he said while showing the human female who had smiled before her execution and her words about Earth. Learning what happened, the Vrelian commanders asked about human military capabilities, and Thrace shared everything he had learned through painful experience, and he explained that human civilian colonies were essentially military outposts disguised as farming communities, and every human, from age 10 to death, maintained some level of combat readiness. Their children learned tactics alongside mathematics, Thrace said while showing footage of human educational programs that included survival skills and threat assessment and basic combat training. Their farmers can field-strip military weapons, and their teachers know how to make explosives from common materials, he continued, and the implications made the Vrelian officers exchange worried glances. Some species dismissed Thrace's warnings as cowardice or exaggeration, and they pointed to humanity's limited territory and small fleet as evidence that the threat was overblown, and these skeptics continued normal operations in systems near human space without changing their behavior. 3 of these skeptical species learned hard lessons when their vessels attempted to raid human mining operations for resources, and the miners fought back with improvised weapons and tactical coordination that destroyed raiding parties and captured survivors. And Earth's response was swift, and overwhelming human warships appeared in the home systems of the raiding species within days, and they delivered ultimatums that demanded reparations and formal apologies and trials for anyone involved in the attacks. And when one species refused, the humans demonstrated their weapons by destroying an uninhabited moon in their system. The demonstration took 12 minutes and used weapons that carved the moon into fragments with precision that spoke of incredible technological capability, and the message was clear that humans could do the same to inhabited worlds if pushed, and the species paid the reparations on Earth. The Security Council debated their next moves, while public opinion demanded stronger responses to what many humans saw as continued aggression from species that did not respect their sovereignty, and the political pressure pushed toward military demonstrations that would establish clear boundaries. "We need to show strength," Admiral Chun argued during the closed session, and her voice carried the same cold certainty that had terrified the Krillian Council, and she advocated for preemptive strikes against any species that had attacked human interests. "We need to avoid becoming what they fear," Counter-Admiral Williams responded, and he represented the diplomatic faction that believed humanity's future depended on integration with the galactic community rather than isolation through intimidation. The debate lasted for weeks, while human colonies reinforced their defenses and human corporations withdrew from non-human markets, and the economic impact created pressure on other species to find diplomatic solutions before the situation deteriorated further. Final decision represented a compromise that satisfied neither faction completely, but established a framework that humanity hoped would prevent future attacks, and they called it proportional deterrence. And the doctrine was simple and terrifying. For every human killed by alien aggression, Earth would respond with escalating force until the aggressor sued for peace, and the response would start with economic sanctions and move through military demonstrations and targeted strikes, and finally total war. "If necessary, we will give every species one chance to learn," Admiral Chun explained during the public announcement that was broadcast across the galaxy, and her words carried weight because everyone had seen what happened to the Krillian mercenaries. "Attack us once, and we will respond with measured force designed to teach you the consequences," she continued, and the footage showed human warships on exercises that demonstrated capabilities far beyond what intelligence agencies had estimated. "Attack us twice, and there will not be a third time," Admiral Chung concluded, and the threat hung in the galactic consciousness like a sword waiting to fall. The doctrine achieved its intended effect, and attacks on human interests dropped to nearly zero within 2 months, and species that had considered humans easy targets now treated them with cautious respect, and human diplomats found that negotiations became much more productive when everyone understood the cost of failure on Nouvelle Terra. The colonists rebuilt their damaged infrastructure while mourning the 43 dead who had given their lives defending their home, and the memorial service drew attention from across human space and became a symbol of humanity's refusal to accept victimhood. Governor Sarah Chun stood before the memorial wall where each name had been carved into black stone imported from Earth, and she wore the scars from the battle on her face and arms, and she carried them with quiet pride that spoke of survival rather than victory. "We did not want this war," Governor Chun said while thousands attended in person and millions watched via holographic broadcast, and her voice carried the same calm authority that had marked her original defiance of Thrace's ultimatum. "We did not ask to be warriors," she continued while looking at the names of the children who had died, including a 12-year-old boy who had detonated himself to kill enemy soldiers. "We came to the stars hoping to leave that part of ourselves behind," Governor Chun said, and her words acknowledged the violence in human history that Admiral Chun's message had revealed to the galaxy. But when forced to choose between peace and survival, humans will always choose survival, she explained, and the colonists listening knew this truth from their own experience in the streets and buildings where they had fought. "And we will make sure the choice never has to be made again," Governor Chun concluded while her hand touched the memorial wall and she felt the names under her fingers. The speech resonated across human space and became a rallying cry for colonies that reinforced their defenses, and for military units that trained with renewed purpose, and for politicians who supported expanded military budgets. And it reminded everyone what humans were willing to do when threatened. In the shadows of the galaxy, various powers watched and calculated and tried to understand the new reality, where humans had revealed themselves as something more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The Eldari hegemony saw opportunity in humanity's military capabilities, and they approached Earth with proposals for military alliances that would give them access to human weapons and training in exchange for resources and territory, and the negotiations were still ongoing. The Terminus Collective saw a threat in humanity's expansion, and they began fortifying their borders and developing weapons specifically designed to counter human tactics, and they prepared for conflict they hoped would never come, but expected eventually. The Merchant Guild saw profit in humanity's withdrawal from existing trade agreements, and they positioned themselves as intermediaries between human corporations and alien markets, and they charged premium rates for their services. But all of them now understood one fundamental truth that would shape galactic politics for generations, and Thrace had tried to explain it, and Admiral Chun had demonstrated it, and the colonists of Nouvelle Terra had proven it with their blood. Humans were not just another species joining the galactic community, and they were not peaceful farmers who could be exploited without consequence, and they were not primitive Nukem